Chapter 11. Chapter 11. If you remember 9, 10, and 11 in the book of Romans, Paul is answering charges that have been brought up by the Jews that, hey, wait a minute, if salvation is through Jesus Christ and through Jesus Christ alone, and not because we are Jews and we are from the family of Abraham, if that's the case, then all the stuff that God said in the past is not true, and God has failed. His plan of saving Israel has failed. And Paul has been addressing these things. We've gone through several of the reasons as he's been going through of why God's plan has not failed. A good part of it was because they didn't understand the plan. Again, read the book. So first one he said is dealt with. He said, well, salvation has always been by the sovereign election of God. God bless you over there. God chooses who is and is not saved. He chooses who gets chosen. And this has happened in the Old Testament. This isn't anything new. Not every Jew is chosen. God picks and chooses. That's why, that's two. She usually has three. One more. Should we wait? Okay, go ahead. But just like he picked Jacob instead of Esau, and he picked Isaac instead of Ishmael, even though the order of birth should have been the other way, he used those arguments. He said, wait, no, God has always, his plan has always been through sovereign election. The second thing, there we go. Not all Jews would be saved, and some Jews would be. And again, he pointed out, and all through these arguments, he's been taking them back to the Old Testament and showing them. And so he took them in the book of Hosea, and he took them into the book of the prophet Isaiah, and he showed him where God said that some Gentiles would be saved. So it's not all just about the Jews. And then he points out that any failure to obtain salvation with regard to the Jews is their own fault, because they have chosen, rather than to believe God, they have chosen to believe in their own method of salvation, which is by the works. And they say, we'll earn our own salvation. We don't want grace. We don't believe in grace. We don't need grace. And Paul's argument is, so when you don't get saved, and salvation is by grace and grace alone, and you don't want it, guess what? It's your own fault. It's your own fault. So now we're going to get to a fourth answer to his argument. He's going to give him another reason why God's plan has not failed. And by failed means that God has utterly rejected the nation of Israel and rejected the Jews. Paul says in chapter 11, verse 1, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. This is God forbid, absolutely not. For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. He said, I can prove to you right now that God has not failed to save any Jews. I'm a Jew. And I've been saved by grace through belief in Jesus Christ. And so he says, hey, if he saved me, that means he saves others. So he hasn't failed. As long as one single Jew is saved, even if it's just one, then you can't make a charge that God has rejected his people completely. And of course, then he's going to go on and talk about his next reason. He says in the next one, look, we're going to read 2 through 10. See how we're flying tonight. Verses 2 through 10, chapter 11. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel? Y'all remember the story that he's talking about? Or maybe this one. He said, Lord, they have killed your prophets, and they have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. Now, do you remember the story? That might be one of the stories we go back and go through. We mentioned it briefly a couple weeks ago. And it's the story where all the hundreds of prophets to Baal were out, and it was all of those priests against Elijah up on Mount Carmel. And they said, well, here, we'll see. And to the Israelites, y'all need to pick. You need to choose. You're either going to follow Jehovah, or you're going to follow those guys, but you've got to make a decision. He said, here's what we'll do. All you 300, y'all make a big old fire and you make an offering to your gods, and let's see if he'll accept it. We'll see if fire comes down and burns it up. And of course, they're dancing and doing stuff, and they're cutting each other all day long. All 300 of them, all running all around. And Elijah's over there sitting going, Finally, the day there's not much light left. He goes, well, okay, my turn. And if you remember the story, he had his offering on the fire, and he had him bring in these big jars. That word for jar it's not like a little pot. And he had him dump these jars on, and he dug a trench around it, so it actually had water, like a moat all the way around. They had dumped some more water. Hey, let's dump some more. And they dumped it and dumped it like this. And basically he cried out to God, and God says not only sent down fire and burnt the offering, he burnt the whole pile up. Now the Israelites who had all gathered around, guess what they're thinking? Well, I don't want those guys' God, I want the God. And of course what resulted from that is basically Elijah said, well, we can't have false priests out there, can we? No! Okay, kill them. And they killed them. Now these priests were the priests of Jezebel. And when Jezebel found out that Elijah incited all of the Israelites to kill all of her priests, she basically, put out a hit on him and said, basically, as soon as we see you, you're dead. You're a dead man. You're gone. And of course, he had this great, wonderful victory, and then he gets scared. And so he runs and he hides, and God finds him. And he's, cowering and hiding under a little bush. And so God said, what are you doing here? And so this is what happens. What he says is, in this passage that he's talking about, notice how he says, he pleads with God against Israel. He said, God, your people are no good. Lord, they've killed your prophets, and they've torn down your altars. I'm the only one left who loves you and is devoted to you. Basically, he said, God, sick them. God, you need to go get them. I'm the only one left. Verse 4 says, but what is the divine response to him? What did God say to Elijah? God said, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. He said, I got 7,000. You think you're the only one? You have no idea how many there are. And Paul says, in the same way then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. So they're saying, well, this means none of the Jews are going to be saved, according to what you're telling us, Paul. He says, no, Jews are getting saved. I'm saved. I'm a Jew. And there's a bunch of others. There are other Jews being saved. Now, I can't give you all their names any more than Elijah could name all those 7,000, but God knows who they are. He said there's a bunch of Jews being saved. So God's plan is working. And he says it has come to be according to God's grace. Not according to works, it's being done by grace. And he says, but if it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. What's the difference between grace and works?
Grace is given by God. Right?
Grace is given. What do you have to do to get that?
Nothing.
Just be faithful.
Nothing, honey. Nothing. Now, when you work for a reward. That's the whole reason you work, for a payday. Okay, so you work to earn something. And so if salvation is by works, then when we do the works, God owes us salvation. And that's how the Jews operated. They said, we're going to work really hard and obligate God And he has to save us because we've done these rituals and we made these offerings and we wore these clothes and we kept the Sabbath and we did all these things, so God has to save us. And Paul said, no, that's not how it works. It works by grace. And now we're back to God's sovereign choosing and election. But so what then? So what does this mean, in other words? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. What are they seeking? By all the rites and the rituals, and what were they seeking? Salvation. Entrance into the kingdom of God. That's what they wanted. And he says, and they haven't obtained it. They keep looking and working hard for it, but they ain't earning it. They ain't getting it. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. God chooses who he chooses, and he passes by the others. And somebody says, well, that's not fair of God. Remember, we talked about that. We don't want fair. If you want what's fair, then you're asking for justice. And if you're asking for justice, all of us are condemned to hell. That's what's fair. That's what's just. Because we're all sinners. But God, in his sovereign choice, has chosen to save some. And they say, well, what about the others? That's not right that God, and go back to right and fair, but he didn't pick them. Well, God didn't cause them to go to hell. God didn't cause them not to be saved. They're not saved because of their disobedience and their sin. So it's not like God said, I'm going to save this person, and that person, they deserve to go to heaven, but I'm not going to let them. I'm going to unpick them. No, everybody is headed for hell, and God picks some out. Now, why does he pick this person and not that person? I don't know. But if God didn't choose some out, all would be condemned. All. Everyone. Jesus talked about remember the broad way that leads to destruction? All humanity is headed down the broad way. Christ is the way. He's the narrow way that goes off. It is a difficult way, and it's hard to find. So Paul is talking about that. And then he goes on, just as it is written in verse 8, God gave them a spirit of stupor. It's a word we don't use very often. Anybody got anything other than stupor?
Slumber.
What?
Slumber.
Okay.
You in verse 8?
Verse 8.
No, stupid.
And again, this is a quote from Deuteronomy. He gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. Remember last week we talked about, even back when God was giving Moses the directions so that he could repeat the law to the people before they went into the land of milk and honey. Remember, because Moses wasn't going. And the first generation who had heard all of this before, back at Mount Sinai, he was now repeating it. That's what Deuteronomy means, the second law. It's the second time he's given the law. God told Moses, Moses, guess what? This is what's going to happen when they get over there. They're going to get fat and happy and prosperous, and they're going to turn to other gods. And he goes on to say that they're not going to hear. You can tell them and tell them and tell them, then they're not going to hear. They're not going to have eyes to see or ears to hear, and down to this very, very day. And David, quoting from a psalm, says, let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. And let their eyes be darkened to see not and bend their backs forever. In the same way that we can understand how sin can enter into our life and cause us not to see things in the same way that God sees them. Remember, the Bible talks about Jesus being the light, but man really doesn't want the light because they prefer the darkness. Well, what's happened is God has chosen to give them a spirit of stupor. They have chosen to reject God. They have forgotten, they've killed his prophets, as Isaiah said, and they've rejected, they killed the Messiah. Everything they've disobeyed, they won't listen, even the preaching now, even after the proof of the resurrection, and they still will not believe. And God says, fine. If you don't want to believe, stay in your unbelief. And he hardened their hearts. Now, this is not to individual Jews, but to the Jews as a people or as a nation or as a collective group. Because as Paul pointed out, still some Jews are being saved, and I'm one of them. You do realize all the disciples, when we start reading through there, those people, those 3,000 that were in the temple at Pentecost, who were saved at that first preaching of Peter, you realize they were all there at the festival at the temple. Well, guess what? I'm getting at least 2,999 of them were Jews. And if not, they would at least been proselytes. So God was saving individuals. He was still calling them out. But the Jews as a nation, God has given them the spirit of stupor, which means He is not enabling them to see the truth. Once they reject to get to a certain point. And sadly, I think this still works today, not in every case, but there are some people to where you can witness to and you can talk to until you're blue in the face, and you can witness every single day, and they can turn you down every single day for year after year after year, and their heart is getting harder and harder and harder. Now, I'm not saying God can't do something about that, but as a rule, you'll see that this is what happens, and God almost turns them over to their sinfulness and gives them what they ask for. The other reason, did we get all the way to now in verse 10? Yeah. All right, now the next reason why God's plan hasn't failed. So the reason that we just read, God, it hadn't failed because He always said He was going to have a remnant of the Jewish nation, and He pointed to that story about Elijah. The sixth reason God's plan hasn't failed, because the plan of salvation was now being offered to the Gentiles, and it was being done in order to create envy among the Jews. And by creating envy within the Jews, it was a way, Paul says, to save them. Verses 11 and 12. I saved them, Paul said. They did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Now by this means stumble, trip over the gospel to fall into eternal hell. Okay? Did they? And he says, may it never be. By their transgressions, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. And if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? God has now placed the Jews in, I always say, it's like they're in a big timeout. And when this happened, when the Jews as a nation, as a people, not individual, but as a people, rejected the Messiah that they had been praying for and God had prophesied and told them about all through the Old Testament, and when He came and fulfilled all of those prophecies, He wasn't the right kind. We'll wait for the next one. And so God said, He punished them for their disobedience. And He gave them this stupor. And other places in the Bible talks, it's as if scales have dropped over their eyes. They can't see, they can't hear the truth that is right before them. They read Isaiah 53. You do know what's in Isaiah 53? Right, about Jesus on the cross and dying on the cross and dying pierced for our transgressions and all. And they can read that and not see it talking about Jesus. They find a way to superimpose it over the whole nation and spiritualize it and all everything. Anything they can do to keep from having it be the Messiah. They can't. They just can't grasp it. And so God says, "So fine. I'm going to put y'all in a big timeout, and here's what I'm going to do. Y'all think it's all salvation is all about y'all, and you're thinking you're the only ones who are going to get it? Guess what? I'm going to give it to these people over here." And they're going, "What? The dogs? You're going to give it to the Gentiles? They don't know anything about you. They never had your word. They don't have your scripture. They didn't have the prophets. They don't have any of this stuff." And God said, "Exactly. Because I'm going to give them salvation by grace. Because it's not about the other stuff." Now, for some Jews, it woke them up. Some individual Jews, they said, "Well, whoa, wait, let's talk about this." and they were open to the gospel message. And that's what Paul said, that he's able to save some by making the other Jews jealous. But over and over, if you read the book of Acts, and Paul would go into the synagogues, he got to town, the first place he would go. Now, his ministry was to the Gentiles. He's going to mention that. To the Gentiles. But the first place he went every single time was into the synagogues and preached Christ. And for the most part, a lot of us say, well, most of them did not believe, but a couple of them, a few of them did, and they would leave him. They'd run him out of town, they'd run him out of the synagogue, they'd drag him out of town and beat him and stone him and everything. But there were always a few Jews who got it. But primarily it was the Gentiles. You see, as he preached about the Gentiles, they didn't like it, but they understood as he opened up the scriptures and God opened up their hearts. So that's what verse 13 says. Now he's going to talk to the Gentiles in particular. Up until this time, he's been answering the Jewish objections about why God's plan has failed. And now he says, just so the Gentiles aren't sitting over there going, yeah, God loves us better. Yeah, we're so much better than the Jews. I'll tell you, there's a lot of Christianity that talks and thinks like that right now, even to this day, anti-Semitism. But Paul says, I am speaking to you who are Jews, verse 13. Inasmuch as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry. He says, yeah, I'm an apostle. God sent me to the Gentiles. Yeah, that's my job. Yep. So yeah. But if somehow I might move my fellow countrymen and save some of them. So he said, I'll magnify. I might be to minister to the Gentiles, but I'm going to magnify. I'm going to make it bigger. I'm also going to preach to the Jews. Hoping that they will see that the salvation is coming by grace of God and God alone, by his mercy, and they will, he said, they will understand. And by that jealousy, they will, not all jealousy results in antagonistic behavior. You go out and you buy yourself, you go in your neighborhood, and man, you get a new truck. Now, the guy who lives on either side of you looks and sees that fine machine. And they're going to respond in one or two ways. They're going to be jealous. Okay? And they'll respond by, they won't like you. You're putting on airs. You're showing me up. They'll have bad things to say about you, Or that jealousy is going to spur them to go get them a trouble. Right? Yeah. And so Paul says, listen, I'm going to magnify my ministry. And the jealousy for some, and he ought to know the jealousy was happened, the antagonistic, the aggression part. And we talked about how many times it was attacked and beaten and slandered and everything else. But also, there were a lot of Jews who came and said, we want to know more about Jesus. And so in talking to the Jews, in verse 15, he says, if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world being the Gentiles. So their rejection is the Jews. So the rejection of the Jews, remember the spirit of stupor, this judicial punishment because of their disbelief and their rejection of the Messiah. He said if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, God calling Gentiles now to him, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? He said, let's think about it, because don't start looking at the Jews and looking down on them. Because as great as it is that they are rejected now and placed over your side, and you have now been called and brought in, if you think that's great, how great will it be that God one of these days is going to turn around and lift that stupor from, and will do a supernatural work, and they will all believe. So now he's starting to talk about the future of the Jews. The future. And he says, if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also. Everybody got that? Mm-hmm. He explains it with the second little phrase. Just this kind of helps you understand what that means. If the root is holy, the branches are too. All right. I think we've done enough here. How does that explain anything? The lump. The lump and the whole dough, the chunk of the dough and the lump. Okay, he's referring to one of the sacrificial offerings that is made in the book of Leviticus and Numbers, particularly Numbers chapter 15. Talks about a grain offering. It's at the end of the year, you've collected all of your grain, and you come to thank God for it. And so what you do, you bring the grain and you make like this little cake out of that grain, and you take it to the priest and offer it as a thanksgiving to God for the bounty. And he's saying, well, listen, if that lump is holy because it's been offered to God, if that little chunk is, then the whole lump is holy, because this is just part of it. And if the root is holy, the branches are too. Now this one is a little bit, we can understand it. A root starts and the tree grows up from that. So if the root is one thing, then as the tree grows, it's not going to be something different. But the deeper meaning of this has to do with the Jews. Has to do with the Jews. Because they're both talking about Abraham. They're both talking about Abraham. Or the patriarchs primarily with Abraham in mind. Israel one day in the future is going to be restored and empowered to accomplish everything that God had planned for them when he called them out. How did God call out the Israelites, the Jewish nation, the Jews, the Hebrews?
Through Abraham.
He called Abraham. And it's the descendants of Abraham, right? So it started with Abraham. So if he's the root and the tree, which is the nation of Israel, is growing up, he's saying, well, listen, God hasn't completely wiped all the Jews out. He hasn't turned his back completely. He hasn't said he's going to utterly reject them forever. Why? Because he called out Abraham for a purpose. And remember, it was to make a people for his own. But they decided not to obey God. They've had some lessons and they didn't really learn from them over the years. And now at this point in time, they rejected the Messiah, and God says, well, fine. Okay, I'm going to set you aside, and I'm going to usher in what is called the age of the Gentiles. And it is now God has placed the Jews in a timeout, and now the gospel message, God is calling out people from all nations all over the world. Still calling individual Jews, keep in mind. But if you go to the nation of Israel, if you go to the teachers and the rabbis and the universities and the Orthodox Jews and talk, no, they still don't. But what he is saying is, if God was started with the lump, then when he gets to with the little piece that was offered, then the lump is still there. And so he's talking about Abraham. Israel is the only nation that God has called out. Everybody else is an individual. God didn't call out the Mesopotamians. He didn't call the Egyptians. He didn't call the Americans. Turn your TV on. I'll guarantee you, he didn't call the Americans. No. Israel is the only nation that he called out. So Paul is now going to give the Gentiles a little bit of a warning about looking down their nose, just because now they're in the age of the Gentiles and God is working in there. Don't you look down on the Jews. Basically, because the Jews are still God's people. They are still God. And he gives this example. And everybody has heard this example about the olive tree. Kind of builds on the root and the branches. How are we doing on time? Dick. All right, real quick. 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became partaker of them, of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. That's the ones that are broken off. Don't be arrogant towards them. But if you are arrogant, remember, it's not you who supports the root. Remember, it's the root that supports you. Gentiles, don't be thinking you're all something special just because God has decided to take you and graft you into his tree. Don't start thinking that you're the tree. We're not. You see, it's the Jewish people who he called. We've just been grafted in. He broke off some limbs and cast them over to the side because of unbelief, because of their rejection. And he grafted in a wild, you know one thing about a wild olive tree? It doesn't produce any fruit. It produces no fruit. So basically God is saying, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this wild tree that produces no fruit, and I'm going to grab, remember, and as Gentiles, we had no, at that time they worshiped Zeus and whoever else and all the false gods. They didn't worship Jehovah. How could they produce fruit for the kingdom? That is the wild olive tree. But he took the Gentiles, who could produce no fruit and never produce fruit, and grafted them into his tree. And when you do that, those of you who are horticulturally enabled, what will happen is that wild olive graft will start producing fruit because it draws the sap and everything from the tree. And the tree gets that nourishment from the roots. And so this is the point that he's making. Listen, you bunch of wild olive trees, y'all weren't doing nothing. Don't be running around with your chest all thrown out, looking down at the Jews just because God has placed them in a timeout. That'd be like, well, we didn't have timeouts when I grew up. It was basically who got the whooping.
Yeah.
But if my brother got a whooping, and I should have, but I didn't, it'd be like my mom was saying, well, you know, you were borderline. You should have got one too. Or if I'd have caught you, if I could have got my hands on it, you'd have got one too. So I've been running all around with your chest all puffed out, thinking you're something special. And if you didn't get one early today, I guarantee you, you're going to earn one before you go to bed. And I did. That's what he's telling the Gentiles. He said, yeah, I'm here to preach to you. Yes, you are my ministry, but I'm still preaching to the Jews. But don't think that just because I'm preaching to you, that everything is all about you. And he says, he's almost like mimicking with the Gentiles. But you'll say, well, the branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Sounds boasting, right? Don't boast about stuff that God does. Remember, they didn't graft themselves in. They ain't the tree. They ain't the root. And he says, quite right, they were broken off of their unbelief. But you stand by your faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. That means respect, honor. Understand that God has done this for you. You know, that wild olive tree didn't get up out of the ground, cut off his roots and run over and stick himself in a notch in a tree and tie himself down. He didn't do any of that. Someone had to go and do that and graft him in. And he said, don't be boasting, don't be conceited, don't be bragging, thinking you've done something special. He said, but you need to be fearful. You need to make sure, you need to worry about your own faith and your own standing before God, Gentile people. For if God didn't spare the natural branches, he'll not spare you either. And almost see that as a message to the churches today. Look at what the church has been. We'll close with this. Look at what the church has been over the years. Back when, about this time, one of the biggest churches were in Asia Minor. You know, we had all the churches that are in the letters that went out in the book of Revelation. All of those, Derbe and Iconium and Lystra and all of those ones in Revelation. Man, Bithynia, Cappadocia, all the ones that Peter talked about in his letter. Man, the church was exploding. That's in modern day Turkey for the most part now. Good luck finding a church. Take Europe, for example. It hasn't only been maybe 500-600 years ago, and there were giant cathedrals packed every single weekend, services all through the day. People like Spurgeon, who preached, would start in the morning and preached all day long as thousands upon thousands came to hear the Word of God. And now if you go into some of those big cathedrals today and walk in on a Sunday morning, you might see 5 or 6 people. Don't be conceited, but fear God and understand, Gentiles, That just because God treated you with favor over here, if you react and respond with unbelief and rejection of the things God has told us to do, if you cast off the natural branches, how much more do you think he's going to take care of the unnatural branches, the ones that he grafted in? We'll stop there. Man, 6 more verses and now to hit my point. Understand what Paul is teaching over and over again. God is not finished with Israel. There are some theologies that say that God is done and the Jews are done. And God is finished with the Jews. He's washed his hands like Pilate and no more. And that we are now, as Christians and Gentiles, we are the spiritual Jews. And that we will replace and we will get all the promises and all the covenants and all the stuff that God promised the Jews originally. We're going to get all that stuff. Well, trust me, we're going to get a bunch of stuff. But God is not finished with the Jews. And all you need to do is read the last 12, 13, and 14 in the book of Zechariah, which speaks about the end days, the end times, the end, and see what God is going to do for the Jews. He is not finished. Because he has chastised them and placed them aside to make them jealous, and also to exercise his grace and put it on display for the Gentiles who weren't looking for him, but yet he calls us anyway. But he's not finished with the Jews. There's coming a day when God will restore them.